And welcome to the Infinite Wisdom interview series, a place for wisdom, knowledge, and imagination, which have always been the greatest of aspirations for humanity's quest towards evolution. These are the words and the ideas of the masters, the leaders, the outliers, who will take you beyond your existing limits of thought and step through the looking glass of imagination to seek out and discover new ideas for breaking the barriers of potentiality and transcending possibilities. Thank you, one and all, for joining us. We're so glad everybody's here on this great journey that we have delved into for the last 4, maybe 5 years, and daring yourself to expand your horizons of knowledge. We have such a vast global community that let us know where you're tuning in from, or if you're new to the show. Tell us where you're from, what country, what city, even drop an emoji if you're this too shy. And because this week's guest, man, is a very special man. He's special because he has the courage to step through a door that most would rather avoid. Because after the passing of his youngest son, Mark Ireland sought evidence for the continuity of consciousness after physical death. On his journey, Mark was able to connect with his son's essence and observed a variety of phenomena supporting the survival hypothesis. Interweaving profound personal experience and scientific evidence, Mark presents a deep dive into psychic medium phenomenon, spirit visitations, afterlife communication, reincarnation, and near-death experiences, pointing out to the postmortem survival of consciousness. And his book, Persistence of the Soul, man, it has touched aching hearts of millions. So, Mark, it's such an honor to have you here. It's to speak with you today. Welcome.
Well, thanks,
Welcome,
Ron.
for sure.
Gary, I'm really looking forward to our chat today.
Okay, that's fantastic. Now, obviously, everyone's first question in most interviews is what motivated you to investigate and write about mediumship and afterlife evidence. But your story is just, it just levels you. Tell us, if you will, about how all this began.
It's kind of interesting because although I took a real mainstream path in my life as an adult, going to the university, getting a degree, getting married young, having a couple kids, and being focused on career and all that, if you go back in my history, I actually grew up with a father who was a psychic and a medium. But, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when he was most prominent, usually in public venues, it would have to be presented more as entertainment, but it was real. And he had his own non-denominational church that was really, he called it the University of Life. It was really more about people's open exploration and not as much dogma, more about an environment where people could see some of these abilities and think, wow, maybe there is something more to us than just being a body and a brain. So growing up, I lived in a household where dad knew everything that was going on. You couldn't get away with anything, which was troubling at times. But at the same time, I saw these abilities as a tangible evidence, as us being something more. I also saw on numerous occasions the mediumship part come through, where he would deliver in public venues, messages from spirit that were specific, had names, had a lot of details about the nature of the relationship and things. And I could see the effect it had on those receiving those messages. So I knew that, yeah, wow, there really is more. We're not just a body and a brain. There's a soul. There's some other aspect of us that goes on after our physical life ends. So going back forward to my adult life, who wants to be their parent? So a lot of people ask me, like, well, did you follow in your father's footsteps? And the answer is no. I do have some of this. It pops in now and then in a more sporadic way. I've not really dedicated myself to developing it. But the real catalyst for me was the unexpected passing of my youngest son, Brandon, when he was 18 years old. He was climbing the mountains behind our home in Scottsdale, Arizona, the McDowell Mountains. and passed unexpectedly. We didn't know the cause of death for a week. But one of the earliest things that happened was, now my dad had been gone by that time, but my uncle had similar abilities. He touched base with me 3 days afterward while I was in the mortuary. We connected by cell phone because I had asked him if he could get any messages. I'd really appreciate it. So he said to me, Mark, I tried to connect last night, but I couldn't get anything. But this morning I was doing my meditation and your dad came to me. He wanted you to know he was there for Brandon when Brandon passed. Brandon was a little confused at first, but your dad helped him adjust. Brandon wanted you to know you're the best parents he ever could have had, which is the warm, fuzzy thing we like to hear. But then he gave me the evidence. He said, your dad said Brandon's death was caused by a lack of oxygen in his bloodstream that caused his heart to fail. 2 days later, I spoke to the physician who had conducted the autopsy, and she told me Brandon had suffered a severe asthma attack, which drove down his blood oxygen levels, causing cardiac arrest. So I got the cause of death 2 days earlier than that from my uncle.
Wow.
Wow.
So you talk about the, connection with your son's essence and your uncle doing this. Most people don't even know where to begin with that. Like, how do you break it down for how does one attempt to make that kind of connection?
Well, there's a variety of phenomena that really point to this. Near-death experiences are one. You have ADCs, or after-death communications, which were in the Guggenheim book, the Hello from Heaven books. And those are just spontaneous things. I'll give you an example of what that's like. So 6 months after Brandon passed, my wife was sitting at the foot of our bed. Now, we had just been on a 7-day cruise. It was to celebrate Brandon's graduation from high school, but since he wasn't physically here, we took his best buddy and our older son. Before leaving on the trip, we had loaned Brandon's bass guitar, because he was a bassist, to a friend we'd met named James Linton. James was actually on the mountain the day Brandon died, but his group got there too late and couldn't help. But he reached out to us through an online obituary. We connected, became friends. Now, James is a musician, guitar player, composer, and singer. So while we were on a trip, he said he was working on a new album and he wondered if he could borrow Brandon's bass. So we loaned him the bass. We come back. The day that we're back after a 7-day cruise, my wife Susie's sitting at the foot of our bed. All of a sudden, she feels a presence near her, and she actually sees a shadow figure out of her peripheral vision, and she knows it's Brandon. So this is really comforting and made us very happy. The next day, we get a call from James, and James says, Susie, I have something to tell you, but I don't know how to share it. And she thought he'd broken the bass guitar, but no, he says, I was in the studio recording a song, and I felt another presence in the studio with me. And then I saw a shadow figure out of my peripheral vision, identical to Susie's experience, but he knew nothing of her experience. Then he saw flashes of white light. He thought he was hallucinating, so he went and got some water. He ate something. He took a shower. But every time he came back, it was getting stronger and stronger. And then at the end of that, he just said, okay, Brandon, what do you want? And then he felt guided to redo the lyrics and bass line in the song. At the end of it, he said, this song's called The Other Side. It's the best song I've ever written, but I didn't write it. So that's an after-death communication, actually a pretty validating one, because you had the back-to-back experiences from two different people that were nearly identical without the other knowing that it had happened. Right. So ADCs are another way. And, there's reincarnation research that's been done for years by the University of Virginia, initially by Dr. Ian Stevenson, and now by Jim Tucker, who's carried that on. So there's a wide array of these phenomena. I focus more on the mediumship because that's what I grew up with, and that's more accessible. I mean, not everyone's going to have a near-death experience, but when your kid passes or your spouse or whoever, you want, I guess Dr. Julie Beischel of Winbridge calls it continuing bonds. The continuing bonds help with grief and help you carry on, realize that you're not disconnected. It's just different than it used to be. So to that end, I could give you another form of direct connection. This actually happened before my uncle gave me the message. This was a day or two after. I wanted a direct connection. And so what I did was I went into a darkened room, which was actually a walk-in closet, shut off the light, and tried to get into a meditative state, asking for something from my son, asking for a connection of some sort. Within a reasonable period of time, I saw an image of his face scroll across my mind's eye, if you will. And he was smiling, joyful, and he was glowing. And that felt really good. But then what followed right after that was an image of a cross with an oval loop at the top. Now, at the time, I'd seen those, but I didn't really know what they were. So me being somewhat analytical, I had to go Google it afterwards, found out that it's an Ankh, which is the oldest cross of human history, about 5,000 years old, from the Egyptians, with the lower portion representing physical life, the oval loop representing eternal life. So what I got was a coded puzzle that I had to solve, which was much more affirming to me than if I'd already known what an Ankh was, because then I could have said, oh, my subjective mind, my subconscious mind just wanted to make me feel better, you know? So those are some examples. And then the mediumship, where that comes in, I guess where I got thrust back into that, it's kind of interesting. 3 weeks after Brandon's passing, I was watching the Channel 12 NBC affiliate news in Phoenix, and they had an excerpt on some studies being done by a researcher at the University of Arizona using mediums under blinded conditions, asking them questions as a proxy with sitters in the area, but not in view of the medium, nor the sitters in view. Neither could see each other, nor could they communicate. The medium couldn't ask questions, and they couldn't have direct communication. And in this, they actually featured a medium named Alison Dubois, who later became famous because of the NBC show Medium. She was the storyline for that.
Mm-hmm.
But this was probably almost a year before that show came out. Well, almost. But I was really impressed because they were asking very specific questions, and she was giving a lot of detail and things outside of what they asked. And then they debriefed with the sitters at the end, and it was all right on the money. And it wasn't general stuff, it was specific stuff. And I thought to myself, gosh, I'd love to have a reading from her, and I'd love to be in that lab someday. And little did I know both things would eventually happen. Ironically, the very next day, and this tells me my dad was maybe working behind the scenes to help, I get a call from a man out of Dallas, Texas named Jerry Concert, who had known my dad and was friends with him. And he says to me, hey, Mark, I know what you've been through, and I know someone who might be able to help you. Her name is Alison Dubois, and here's a phone number you can call for an appointment, which was kind of mind-blowing to get that one day after seeing an excerpt. But even then, before Medium came out, the show, she was very popular. And so she had like an 8-month wait list. I finally got in to see her in August that year. And I'll just give you a tidbit from that, and then we'll go on to the next question, because I've been going on a while here.
It's okay.
Weeks before meeting her, a gentleman gave me a box. I say, well, what is this? And I open it up. It's a manuscript, 8.5 by 11 type pages. It says, Your Psychic Potential, A Guide to Psychic Development by Richard Ireland, 1873. Where'd you get this? He goes, well, it's a manuscript that your dad had. It's based on his ESP workshops from the late 60s and early 70s. I said, well, he says, well, you were out of state at the time. I said, well, you've had it for 12 years. Why are you giving this to me now? He says, I don't know. I just feel like I'm supposed to. 2 weeks later, I meet Alison. One of the first things she says to me is, well, I've got your father here, and he's showing me a book, but I think it's his book, but he's handing it to you to take forward. Does that make sense to you? I'm like, yeah, I think I know what that is. And I subsequently actually got the book published back in 2011. So there's a few things for you.
That's amazing. That really. So prior to this tragic incident with your son, had you had any previous experiences yourself personally with connecting with any other souls or essences in the past?
I'd had some psychic stuff happen when I was younger. I wouldn't call it mediumship. I did have a mediumship later as an adult within the last few years that I can explain to you. I'll give you one of the early ones, which was pretty crazy. I was 18 or 19 years old, dating a girl, had a dream one night that she was seeing another guy, and it made me jealous. But ironically, I knew his first and last name and what he looked like. So the next day I told her about this dream. I said, I had this dream, and she goes, well, tell me about it. I'm like, nah, it's just a dream. And she goes, no, go ahead and tell me. And I'm like, okay, well, this guy looked so tall. He had this color hair. His name was Bob Dooley. And she's like, oh my God, I dated a guy named Bob Dooley when I lived in Kansas, and he looked just like that. So that was kind of wacky. But more recently, for a 3-year stint, I'd been invited to speak at a church in San Francisco called the Golden Gate Spiritualist Church. Now, that's a kind of church that embraces these sort of phenomena and actually relishes them, and is kind of built around them. And I would go and do a talk, and each time I brought a medium friend, Tina Powers from Tucson, and she would give messages to the people there after I had my talk. Well, this one particular time, she's like, "Hey, Mark, I think you're going to get a message to share with the congregation. If you get it, will you share it?" And I'm like, "Sure, Tina." She kept hounding me about this over and over again. I couldn't understand why she just wouldn't let it drop. And even the day we walked into the church, I'm like stepping into the church, and she's like, "Mark, if you get a message, will you share it?" And I'm like, "Yes, Tina, I told you I would. If I do, I will." So we're about 30 minutes before I have to go up. So I go into their healing room. People are getting laying on of hands healing. But it's a very quiet room. I sit on the bench to an organ or piano, shut my eyes, and try and get in a meditative state for two reasons, really, to just see if I get any inspiration, but also just to like prepare myself to do the talk. So I go up, I do the talk, and at the end, I'm like, oh, before that, I forgot to tell you what I got. I'm sitting on this bench, and while in that meditative state, a name pops into my mind, Max. And then immediately after that, Maxine. So I thought, oh, maybe it's Maxine and not Max. Now, I didn't see these names. I didn't hear these names auditorily. They came in like an idea, just like an impression. But when I went to do my talk, I finished, and at the end I said, Tina had made me promise that if I got any messages, I'd share them with the congregation. So I have to ask if the names Max or Maxine mean anything to anyone here. Now, this church was founded by a woman named Florence Becker in 1924. She'd passed in 1970, and by all accounts, she was much like my father in terms of abilities. So that's relevant to this story, because when I shared the names Max or Maxine, the pastor of the church, his jaw dropped, and he's like, well, Max and Maxine were twins born to the church founder, Florence Becker. They actually were delivered stillborn, and they grew up on the other side in spirit. And that's a secret that only a couple of longtime church members even know. And then at the end, he took me upstairs and showed me a painting that I believe Florence Becker painted. It was a landscape with a long winding road, and at the end were two little figures. And he says, those two figures are Max and Maxine. So that one's fairly dramatic, and it impressed upon me why Tina did that, because it was so subtle. I could easily have dismissed those names as like nothing, or thought that I just made them up. But you talked about imagination earlier. It's actually a fine line between imagination and inspiration. So that information, by sharing it, it turned out to be highly significant and pretty validating, because even one of those names isn't a common name, but two together is pretty off the wall.
Right.
Totally.
Wow.
Mm.
That's pretty amazing. So now you've written about a lot of these experiences. So you have, I think, 3 or 2 other books prior to Persistence of the Soul.
Yeah, Soul Shift is my first book, Soul Shift,
Mhm.
Finding Where the Dead Go. And that's really a lot of what I've spoken about so far is in that book. That was the initial journey that I took after Brandon passed, that kind of reintroduced me to my dad's field, where I had some of these direct experiences like I've described with my wife and with the Ankh, and others as well. And then it set me on the path of meeting some of these world's top mediums and getting readings from them. Allison's being one, another with Jamie Clark of Phoenix, Linda Williamson of England, and then finally with Lori Campbell when I was in the lab. And there's actually a Discovery Channel clip of that experiment that people could see on my website as well. So the Linda Williamson one was really interesting, and all of them had a lot of detailed information. They were all high quality, and there was a lot of overlap. The Linda Williamson one was pretty interesting because this is a number of years ago, and she had talked about how I would be just speaking my truth to people, and that's all I really had to do, and it would bring a lot of learning and comfort to people, and an organization would form around me just by being myself. And as I think you mentioned in my bio, I'm now co-founder of an organization called Helping Parents Heal for Bereaved Parents, and it's got 26,000 members worldwide, 175 affiliate chapters, and we have a conference every other year. Next one's in 24, and it'll draw 1,000 people. So it was just interesting to see in that particular reading where that went. But yeah, Soul Shift was the first book. And then I got my dad's book published next, the one I mentioned, the manuscript, Your Psychic Potential. And that's more of a guide for people who want to develop, their intuition, their psychic phenomena, their abilities, or even mediumship. And then Persistence of the Soul is my next book. And that just came out about a month and a half ago.
So that's a killer title. What does it mean to you, and how did you come up with it?
It's interesting because the first book I argued and about the title. We had to go through a whole gyration to get what I was happy with. But ultimately Soul Shift was from an intuitive thing that came to me at 4 a.m. one night. But the persistence of the soul was the same thing. It was kind of just an intuitive thing that came to me, and it just felt right. It sounded right. And they didn't mess with it. They left it alone. So I was really pleased with that. They did the subtitle, and the subtitle really just sums up some of the areas that are investigated in the book. It's
Right.
it's a different approach too. What I sought to do was share more of the personal experiences and personal evidence, but then add in the science and the history and other things supportive of those things. So it's kind of two books in one. You know, some
Yeah, which
people,
makes it kind of unique, right? I mean, because there's a lot of, I mean, there's countless books and through history that talk about the afterlife type stuff. So, I mean, that's a unique approach that you bring to the book, which is pretty cool.
thank you. I think some people just favor the personal experiences. That's all they already are
Hmm.
quote unquote believers. But then you have
Yeah.
open-minded skeptics. I don't think debunker skeptics are going to read my book, but open-minded
Yeah.
skeptics may, and the science will address them. And then you have the average middle of the road person who may read it all and find, that my experiences are validated by, the other information, the research information. So I
Hmm.
think that's why I did it that way, and I've had good feedback. It's a different kind of read. It's probably not for everybody, but I think it's pretty effective for those who really want that kind of broader look at all of that phenomenon.
Yeah. I think when you add the science into books like this, it grabs the people who want to believe, but their logical mind is still kind of in the way,
Yeah,
and so the logical mind accepts it and like, oh, okay, I'm gonna follow this path.
and
So,
that was my hope. Yeah.
when your father passed away, did you have any similar experiences? Did he come into your life after?
Not initially. Not, I wouldn't say immediately. I'm trying to think back because it's been a number of years. That was like 1992, so it's been quite a
Mhm.
while. Um, and um, I was a little frustrated with my dad at the time. Although, we had a good meeting just probably 2 weeks before he passed, and I could tell he was going to pass because he knew it. You could just tell because he hugged me tighter than ever, and he actually cried and said, "I'm proud of you," which it's the first time I ever remember him saying that. One of the mediums later on said, "Your dad says he's proud of you," so that reminded me of that. But it was much. I'd say it was later. Now my uncle may have given me some messages, but at this point I just don't remember whether I didn't. I can't say that I had anything directly, maybe in dreams and things, but after Brandon passed, it just kind of the floodgates open on communication with my father.
Right. Wow, that's and is your mother still with us?
She passed in 2013, but she made it to almost 85.
Oh,
So
very
yeah, I'll
good.
tell you a funny story about them. This is kind of veering off for just a second, but this is kind of what it was like living with him. So when they were first married, um, she had been working on being a vegetarian for a couple of months and was successful at it. And then one day she just had this craving for a hamburger, and she went out and got a burger, came home, and that night Dad returned home and said, "Hey Shirley, how'd you enjoy your burger today?" So she's like, "Darn you!" So that's what it was like.
It's pretty funny.
But he
So,
busted my brother too when he was a teenager for having somebody buy him beer when he was underage and for drag racing and all these kinds of things. So my brother's response, and he was 10 years older than me, but his response was, "How would you like to have a dad like you?"
yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, we interview a lot of guests with different types of experiences and abilities, and a lot of them say that, we all have these abilities. They're they're in our DNA. They're there, but they've just been kind of covered over or pushed down, for the fear of being different, for the fear of societal opinion. Um, have you Do you feel that same way, that everybody actually really has this? It's I don't want to dismiss the uniqueness of it, but is it more common than people realize that we have these abilities to to communicate with spirits and with other energies and essences that are out there.
Yeah, I do agree. I think in the simplest form, it's just intuition. And if you go back probably to ancient humans, they probably had a lot of this and they
Hmm.
used it to protect themselves and survive. You know, if a woolly mammoth is coming around the, well, whatever animal, a bear is coming around the corner or something like that, maybe they have an intuition about those kinds of things or where to find food or where to find water. So I think over time, if you look at modern humans, we're so inundated with sensory information from smartphones and computers and TV and multimedia and music. It's almost, it gets pushed down because it's a very subtle thing. Think back to what I described with my experience in that spiritualist church and why Tina was prodding me, because that's a
Mhm.
very subtle thing that I got, much more subtle than talking to somebody or hearing something. And few of us, I think, take the time to really quiet ourselves enough to hear that and listen to it and be guided by it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just a gut feel. Like if I follow my gut, more times than not, it steers me the right way. Now, I will say that I think there's wide ranges of ability, natural ability. Now, people can develop. You could start with a small potential and work real hard and end up further down the road. But I think there's some people that just with an unbelievable natural aptitude. I think it's the same thing as like anybody can play piano, but how many can be a concert pianist? I play
Mhm.
guitar. You know, I'm pretty good, but I'm not Eric Clapton. Uh, so I think it's kind of like that. I think if you take somebody like my dad, who was born with just this innate ability, and then he met somebody who mentored him to develop to a high level, that's what you end up with. And so today I know some of the very top people, and they're phenomenal. And I could tell the difference between them and somebody who has it, but it's just not quite as refined or quite as good. And I'd say the mentorship is part of it. That natural innate ability is the biggest piece. But everyone can use this for their own advantage, just like I did to connect with my son when I went into that walk-in closet, um, or or even just to, like if you're troubled in your life or you're looking for direction, trust that small inner voice to give you some guidance. Um,
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people are dealing with. I mean, we're always throughout the human existence dealing with death, but I mean, we're in a age where I mean, the death toll, just because of age variable, is increasing, right? Just because the older population, the boomers, are at that stage where they're passing on and leaving kids and loved ones and whatnot. And dealing with loss of a loved one is heavy at any stage. How has your perspective on grief evolved, or has it since your journey into this realm and the connections that you've had?
yeah, and I'd back up first to just tag on to what Ross had asked me. I think the fear is a factor too, because people are fearful of phenomena they don't understand,
Unknown.
and
Yeah,
also fearful of how they'll be perceived. They don't want to be
mhm,
perceived as woo-woo or out there or whatever. They want to be
totally.
accepted in a mainstream way. So I'm sorry, could you just recap that last question? Because I had an answer, but then I got off track.
Yeah, just pointing out that I think that we're in an age where more and more people are at the end of life and they're leaving others behind, and so there's a heaviness of loss that people feel because of that. And I was just asking, how has your perspective on grief evolved since your experience and since your journey into these realms, and also any advice that you have for folks that grappling with that pain? I mean, obviously it's why you started the parents thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think the first problem is we live in a very materialistic society that believes in, they've been taught physicalism, that you're just a body and a brain. And
Yeah.
when that goes away, consciousness ends. So that's the first problem. And then on the other spectrum, you have more fundamentalist religion that a lot of people just don't buy because it's like, this is too hard to believe. And the ones that do, they're fearful of this because they think it's not right, although the New Testament supports a lot of these things. But they want to say it's all reserved for one period of time.
Yes.
So what I'll tell you is I've kind of developed what I call the 5 pillars of healing. And this is from observations of the people that I've seen come into our program, the bereaved parents, how they came in a very despondent, discouraged, depressed state, and how they either left in a more joyful, uplifted, and hopeful state, or at least stayed involved and were at that more hopeful state. I can't say it works for everyone, but we have a lot higher percentage success rate than most of the other groups that are like us. And the reason we exist is because we're the only one for parents who allow the open discussion of spiritual experiences and afterlife evidence. So tagging onto that, what I call the 5 pillars of healing, the first pillar is support from family and friends. Not everybody has that. Some people do. If you do, it's a real plus to have that support and backing from family and friends. And for them to understand too, that usually parents want to still talk about their kid. They want to discuss the kid. They don't want that brushed under the rug. And oftentimes people will try and do that because they don't know what to say. The second pillar is meeting and making relationships with people who have been through the same thing, because they can relate to you and you can really talk at a deeper level. And that's a very helpful thing in the process. The third is getting to a point where you could provide service to someone else in some way, whether that means working at a soup kitchen, joining a foundation for some sort of research, or whether that means, helping parents heal or whatever, or organ donation, but something constructive that helps other people, because it circles back to you. I've seen it time and again. If you help others, it helps you. The fourth one is letting go of feelings of guilt. A lot of parents, probably the majority, will say, I should have seen the signs. I could have done this. I could have done that. The reality is you couldn't have. In most cases, you couldn't have changed anything. You have to let go of that. It's holding you back in your healing. So let go of that and just move forward and realize it happened. You can't change destiny. It is what it is. And along the lines, kind of similarly, is people who harbor anger and won't forgive someone else that they hold responsible for that passing, whether it be through an accident or a doctor or a medical professional or something like that. If you forgive that person, it will release that weight from you. As long as you harbor that, you're the one being suffering from it. You're paying the price for that. And then
That's pretty much. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought you were.
No, then there's the fifth pillar, and the fifth pillar is the one I just talked about. That's where it's the hope pillar, and it's being open to evidence for the afterlife. And maybe for most people who initially experience a passing of someone close, it could be reading books like mine, or like books on near-death experiences or things, and then maybe getting a mediumship reading or from a qualified, vetted source, or learning how to meditate, learning how to have a direct connection of sorts. So those are the things I've observed. Now, I'm not saying those are in lieu of a therapy, but maybe in addition to any other tack that you want to take. Those are the things I've observed that have been most helpful to people.
Right. So for our audience, why do you suppose that parents want to take on the responsibility of what happened? That obviously something that in most cases out of their control, but why do we have, as humans, why do we have that need to take the responsibility? I should have, could have, would have.
We always want to assign blame. I don't know why.
Yeah.
It's like somebody's got to be to blame for something, rather than just like, this happened. How do we move forward in a constructive way? How can I repair my life and even get to a point where you could say, I can have a relationship with my child, but it's just going to be different. And where they are now is different. And I need to find that which will make my life joyful and constructive and meaningful going forward. Because I truly believe each of us have a path and a reason for being here. And we don't want to abandon that. I've seen many people who wanted to take their own lives after losing a child. And, fortunately, like some of them had read my book and then reached out to me and said, I was going to take my life, but I read your book and I decided not to. Even at our last conference, I had like half a dozen people walk up to me and I don't know if they meant my books or the organization or both, but they said, I just want to thank you because you saved my life. So when you get that, that you're doing something constructive and helpful. But part of that is they got to do it on their own. It's their own journey to be able to get to that point, to let go of that kind of thinking, because it's not constructive. It's not helpful to anyone.
Right. I mean, I understand where people want to blame somebody in, things that are tragic. I mean, after all, that's what keeps the lawyers in business, and lawyers and insurance companies.
Yeah.
But when there's simply, like in your son's case, I mean, it just happened. And people would say, oh, I should have told him not to go, or I should have.
Well, the reality is I'm in the same boat, because I did that exact thing. I had a strong premonition that morning, And then I thought it's just my imagination, but I still told Brandon, I said, Brandon, please don't go, because it was kind of windy that day and I just felt off. And while I was sitting in my office, I had kind of a feeling of something there that was trying to forewarn me. But when he left, he's 18 years old. He's like, Dad, we're going, like, stop your worrying. And then I just said to myself, you know what, you're just being a worrying parent. But and then I did think back, because I had an opportunity. Someone who worked for me at the time was a neighbor to a famous rock musician that my son liked. And I thought, at the last minute, even crossed my mind, like, maybe I should tell him not to go on this hike because I can get him set up to meet this rock musician. And I thought, no, that's too manipulative. I can't do that. But then after he passed, initially, I thought that way. Maybe I should have done that. But again, I just feel like that would have been a manipulative mood. And like some of my medium friends said, you know what? If he had survived that day, he might have died 2 days later a different way that wouldn't have been as peaceful. So I think it was just his time to go. And I think sometimes young people pass unexpectedly. We all expect the order to be a certain way, but it doesn't always work that way. I felt
Yeah.
like he was a more advanced soul because of all the behaviors he demonstrated were of a highly evolved person, very compassionate, empathetic, embraced kids that weren't popular, didn't care about prestige or how he was perceived, lived for the moment, all those kinds of characteristics that you look for. So I just feel like he was here for a period of time to serve a purpose for the world. His friends all grew from just being around him, and they look back at him and what a quality human he was. The fact that this catapulted me into doing this work that I probably never would have done, that's helped thousands of people, and to set an example, So, and it's interesting too, because a lot of the parents who come to me, they'll say, I read your story and I can't believe how much my son or my daughter was like your son. They're very similar, So it kind of tells me, like, okay, these are more evolved souls. They don't need to be here very long. They're here for a specific period of time, and they're going on before us.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
no,
one,
sorry, Russ. We have a friend who works in the end of life coaching and stuff like that, and I think what you're talking about is just that mental preparation for, hey, it happens, you never know, right? So how do you deal with the emotional stuff of knowing that it could happen when someone's getting old and it's obvious, but then also when it happens out of nowhere, how to deal with the aftermath of that, right? So is that the kind of stuff you deal with the HPH group, the Healing Parents, helping parents heal?
We don't in our meetings get that specific about different causes, but people will connect. Like if somebody's child was murdered, they'll find someone else who is in the same boat and they'll kind of build a relationship. Or kids who passed from suicide, they'll form a relationship. We'll have speakers and guests from time to time. If those meetings, we not only do in-person meetings, but Zoom meetings that are available, nationally and worldwide. And we'll have people like, we had Dr. Raymond Moody on for NDE research. We'll have therapists talk, and they'll address some of the specific things you're talking about, but we'll have mediums
You
on
have
there.
like death doulas, you have death doulas coming in and talking about those kinds of things and doing that. And I mean, it's interesting that that's actually an industry, right?
I don't know that we've had one of those folks come in, but we've had therapists, but that's not a bad suggestion, for those folks who had a prolonged period of time where they knew their loved one was going to pass. And those people probably are a lot of the ones that report seeing these strange phenomena near the end of life, the ADCs, where the person who's getting ready to pass talks to people that aren't there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And periods of terminal lucidity too. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's where someone is in a coma for an extended period. They don't talk, they don't communicate, and then all of a sudden they pop up and they're lucid and they speak and talk, and then they die right after that. So we've not done what you suggested, but that's not a bad suggestion, and I'll take that to the board and see what they think.
Yeah, well, I mean, our buddy Stephen Garrett does a lot of talks like that all in Canada here, and he talks to people about the whole preparation, the and knowing that it's inevitable, and how do you have the conversation around it and just get comfortable with just even talking about it, because people don't want to talk about it, right? And so they
Right.
go inward and they feel alone and they have to deal with all that stuff alone, which, from what I've seen and what you've talked about for helping parents heal, it's about getting out there and having that conversation, being open for that type of connection with others that are going through similar type stuff.
Yeah, and most of our members have already experienced the passing, so we're not kind of getting ahead of the curve. But with something
Got it.
like that, it would help us do that. If someone's child is terminal, and they want to join beforehand and find out about us just to prepare, that's a great suggestion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, Stephen even does the after, right? So it's like because people, how do you have that conversation after he works with that as well. So I think it'd be a great connection for you. Well, we'll connect you up. I think it'd be a good connection.
Awesome, thank you so much.
yeah. I remember the first time I went to his home, and it was the most calming environment I virtually have ever experienced. I mean, you literally just walk through that door, and all of a sudden, you just feel just this calmness. It's amazing.
Well,
And
our
I,
society should have that kind of view of death. I mean, it's like brushed under the rug.
Totally.
It's all about
right,
you.
Totally.
What you see on commercials, it's all 20-year-olds.
Yep.
And that I think goes back to this materialistic mindset, this worldview, because they're afraid of death. You don't talk about it, you hide it.
right,
But in Eastern cultures, it's not like that.
Yep.
correct.
Absolutely.
And it's similar to what we do with our elderly as well in modern society. Is they're a reminder, like, oh, that's going to happen to me, so let's just kind of move them to the side instead of taking them in and nurturing them and cherishing their glory of life.
Yeah.
So in your book, you also you focused on the psychic phenomenon and the mediumship that's in religion and in the past history. Tell us a little bit about that. Because I've had like 20 questions are going to follow after that
Yeah.
one.
The reason I went down that path was really because, at least in the US, it's a predominantly Christian culture or background, Judeo-Christian. And for some reason, a lot of these phenomena have taken a bad, are looked on or frowned on or whatever. So what I point out there is, really, I think these phenomena were persistent throughout the New Testament and supportive. In
Right.
First Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul talks about the gifts of the Spirit. And as they're listed, they're identical to these phenomena that my dad displayed and others display. Jesus talks in the Gospel of John about he meets a woman at a well and tells her all this stuff about how many husbands she's had. And she's like, "Sir, you must be a prophet." There's a story of the Transfiguration where Jesus is said to be talking to dead people observed by his disciples, which is mediumship. So I think a lot of this has just developed over a tradition where it's frowned on or not understood. Maybe it's not as much frowned on by everybody. It's just not understood. And people want to know that it's compatible with their religion. But by the same token, I think that the more negative connotations come from the Old Testament, but they're from books like Deuteronomy and Leviticus that tell you that, okay, if you have a disobedient son, you should take him to a neighboring town to be stoned to death. So things like that. So it's like, okay, let's have a balanced perspective here, people. If there's 66 different books to the Protestant Bible, and so some of this old stuff, I mean, is it possible it was more a product of the culture and tradition of those people at the time who were seeking control? And I still think churches in general want control to some extent over people, how they think and what they do.
Totally.
I think people need to have open mind and develop their own truth. And maybe that's compatible with your church 100%, but I doubt it. Maybe it'll be 50% or 70% or whatever. But the important thing is that you believe it in your heart. If you're just following a dogma that you've been taught and you don't really believe
Yeah.
it, then you're just lying to yourself. My father talked about the golden strand of truth running through all religions. So I think that those high principles,
Mhm.
things like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and things like that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So that chapter was there to put people's minds at ease about looking into these things or having a mediumship reading or considering these phenomena, because they're not bad, they're not evil. I think really where the whole issue came from with this that connotation goes back to the split between science and religion, because after that happened, because, at the time of Galileo, when the church was going after people who said, the earth goes around the sun instead of the other way around, there's a lot of anger
Wait,
on
what?
the
It's not a
science.
flat Earth? Are you telling me it's not flat? No, I'm just joking.
So I think that that
It's wrong.
division got healed. And so at some point in time, during the Enlightenment period, the religious churches were challenged by the science community saying, okay, well, your Bible tells about all these miracle stories. How come none of that's happening today? So the church leaders came up with this thing called a special dispensation. And they're like, well, that was a special dispensation for that period of time. So it happened then. It'll happen again in the future, but nothing's happening right now. So they got into the business.
Taking a break.
Yeah, exactly. It was excuse making from my perspective. So, but that's why that chapter's there, because I want people, let's take a realistic look at this stuff and then come to your own conclusions. If you, it just makes no sense to me. And my dad never understood, like, hey, I've got these gifts. These are the gifts of the Spirit. Why aren't they embraced by mainstream churches? That's probably why he started his own church, and led that direction.
Right. So with that in mind, so there's a couple of different things. I mean, one, when there's actually a belief that exists where people don't fear death, then there's far lack of control that you have over them and such into that. But going off of the mediumships and such, when it comes to death and such, there are a lot of charlatans out there that has given this industry or this thought process a lot of bad publicity. How does an average person who's going through this grief, when someone comes to them and says, I can put you in touch with so and so, what do they do? I mean, they have to be able to stand back and say, how do I know you can do that? Because people are very, very good at reading body language and micro expressions, and they can do an awful lot with somebody who's grieving. So what are your recommendations for people who are going through this but are looking for reliable sources?
Sure. So first off, there are some charlatans. There are some people who try and cheat and steal from others. And I've seen a couple cases. I actually don't think it's that widespread, though. I found more people who are kind of deluded into thinking they have this ability at a high level when they really don't. And that could do an equal amount of damage, because
all right,
not giving a good quality session to someone that's validating. So if you go back to after my first book came out, I was inundated with requests. Hey, who's a good medium? Who's a good medium? Who could I see? And at the time, I knew about half a dozen of them. But by then, they were well-known, world-renowned people with long wait lists, and some of them charged more than people wanted to pay. And I thought to myself, there have to be more people with this ability that are just lesser known, but they have the ability, and maybe they would have short wait lists and charge less. So I decided at that time to start a medium certification program, which I established in 2014. I make nothing off of it. I have a volunteer assistant. She makes nothing. I've invested thousands of my own money, thousands of dollars to develop the website, to feature this, and then over the time maintain it, and then countless hours to do testing. And what we do, I actually derived my protocols from the University of Virginia and Tricia Robertson from the Scottish Society of Psychical Research to put a protocol together for the tests. And the University of Virginia, the test I participated in, I learned more about that in discussion with Dr. Emily Williams Kelly to refine mine. And so what we do is a medium or a prospective medium has to go through 5 blinded readings on Zoom with the video off, reading for someone, and they're only given the first name of the person at the time of the reading and no other information. That reading is then recorded. The sitter transcribes it and breaks it into individual statements that are then graded as correct, incorrect, or indeterminable. Indeterminable would be like a prediction of something that hasn't passed, or a piece of information they just can't find out if it's correct because maybe it involves someone they don't know. And then they can award some bonus points for very specific hits. Here's an example. So say a medium says, I think I have your deceased son here. I think his name started with an A, and I think he liked pizza. Let's say the sitter says, that's right, I lost a son. His name was Aaron, so that's A. That's pretty good. I'll give that's a correct and a 2 bonus points. And pizza was his favorite food, so that's really good too. I'll give 2 bonus points for that. Now let's say the medium instead said, I think I have your deceased son here. His name was Aaron, and he liked pizza with pepperoni, bell pepper, and onion. So the sitter's like, wow, first one's correct. Yes, the son passed. Number 2, his name was Aaron. That's a 5-point bonus, and it's correct. And then his favorite food was pizza with those toppings. So that's a 5-point bonus. At the end of the day, we take all the indeterminable statements are set aside unless there's an inordinate percentage of those. It shouldn't exceed 33% indeterminable. Otherwise, we grade those as incorrect. We then rate the accuracy of correct versus incorrect. You got to have at least 65% correct to pass and 75 total points to pass. So if somebody was 65% correct and had 2 of the 5-point bonuses, they'd have 75%, or 75 points, they would just barely pass. Or if they were 75% accurate and had maybe 5 bonus points, they'd have a score of 80, they would pass. But that's over 5 readings, because usually what you see is you might have 1 or 2 stellar readings, 2 that are good, and maybe 1 they bomb. Even good people will have off days. But the people that have been certified are high integrity folks, and most of them would give a refund if they had a bad session. So that's a process where I vetted, and we now have 41 people on that list.
That's pretty awesome.
And they're gives a bio for each, where they're located, how they connect, what they charge, all that information's there. And if they have a website, it links to them. And we still are testing. We've got a wait list of like a dozen people, prospective mediums that want to get tested. We only have capacity to do 2 at a time. So that's a service I put together as a public service, really, to make sure people would have a resource to go to that's been vetted and is trustworthy. But somebody may know someone who's really good too. And if they had a reading and they were guarded and they didn't, put themselves in a position where excessive cold reading could be done, or where a warm reading where they knew too much about them on the front end and they're confident in them, that's fine too. I know people that are outstanding mediums who have not gone through my program, and I'll still refer people to them because, I've tested them myself personally and then seen that evidence. So, but all these resources, if people go to my website, they can find the link to Helping Parents Heal. They can find a link to my videos of my dad on the Steve Allen show in 1971 doing a demonstration, a link to the certified medium page, and a link to the Discovery Channel piece that I said, and all the information about my books too. So, and I don't know if
helpingparentsheal.com.
No, actually, just go to my website because there's a link to it there, because that's a .org. My page is just markirelandauthor.com. Mark with a K, Ireland like the country, author, markirelandauthor.com. All those other links are right there, so they only have to go to one place to find all that.
Perfect. Yeah, I've got that one here, so we'll make sure that that's going to go into the description for everybody listening. So that's going to be the place to go. So that's going to be awesome, my friend. That was like the fastest hour in history. So we want to recommend again for everybody to look up Mark's books. The current one is Persistence of the Soul, but there's also Messages from the Afterlife and Soul Shift. It sounds like all 3 of them are going to be must reads for everyone, and they seem to be loaded with information for you. And then obviously go to his website, markirelandauthor.com, and where you can find all of these resources. So this has been phenomenal, Mark. I'm so glad that we were able to connect today. And as we close, we want to personally invite everyone listening to our Expanding Beyond Business Mastery private group. The link is going to be in the description. And here you'll see what we do, and that we do things very different and very unique. We take you beyond the traditional business methods and introduce you to new ways of thinking, new ways of communicating, and expanding your purpose-driven mind. How does this relate to Mark? Well, we use some of these techniques. We understand that the human body, the human mind, has more innate powers available to you. And we can show you a number of different ways that you can use these in both your life and in your business. So, and I always like to think of it like the there's a poster of a bumblebee hanging in the NASA Space Center, and the poster says the aerodynamic body of bumblebees is not fit to fly. But it's a good thing that the bumblebee just doesn't know that it can't fly. And what we have found is that so many purpose-driven entrepreneurs simply don't know their own potential to fly. So here's a quick rundown. You're grouped with participants that are selected and screened to participate in a series of intimate brainstorm sessions to create solutions for you. There's no cost, there's no pitching, there's no talking heads, and it's all free for you to promise, just as long as you promise to interact and participate. And if this sounds like something that you need, then just enter hashtag VRT in the comments below, and we'll send you a direct message with a link to the RSVP for the virtual roundtable, where transcending possibilities is just simply the new normal. Mark, thank you so very, very much for taking the time to share your experiences and share your insights. This is going to be a very, very popular interview.
Well, Ross and Gary, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I thought it was a fun discussion. And just a favor for anyone who does pick up The Persistence of the Soul, please put a review on either Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I need more reviews. So thank you for that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You have a great day, and thank you so much for your service to humanity.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.